Amazing. Thank you, Sam. Thank you all for having me. Thanks for being here. This is going to be a little bit of a shift of gears from all of the really interesting earthworm talk we just had. I am Freya Chay, and I work at a nonprofit called Carbon Plan. Carbon Plan is really focused on the scientific integrity and transparency of proposed climate solutions. And one of the main focuses of my work over the past 2 years has been thinking about carbon offsets and carbon markets, including how those systems are starting to talk about soil carbon. As you all know, soil carbon is just one part of the conversation about soil health. So I wanted to start out just by talking about why people who are interested in soil health might want to pay attention to the carbon markets, and why what I would like to share with you today might be relevant in your thinking about the policy landscape in which you are operating. First off, as the global conversation orients around goals like carbon neutrality or net zero emissions, you're seeing a growing interest and demand for carbon sequestration products in general, carbon offsets specifically, and right now, soil carbon sequestration in particular. People like finding climate solutions that are charismatic. We love farmers. We love the idea of all the co-benefits that could come with soil carbon sequestration. And so the narrative and the popular attention towards soil carbon sequestration has really been exploding in the last year or two. And you know, it's interesting to people on the farming or soil health side of the equation, in part because it's a potential source of money to support or reward good things. That's important. We need to be able to support transitions to practices, land management practices that are good for ecosystems and good for farmers. And carbon finance via carbon markets is one way that that might happen. On the flip side, carbon markets are really complex to understand and interact with, especially if you're not coming from that world. And the existing systems have major challenges. That really, unfortunately, can mean that supporting good things, directing money to good things, can actually end up being counterproductive for the climate. So if that all sounds confusing and messy, I hope by the end of this presentation, those kind of two tensions will become more clear, and I hope that you will pepper me with questions whenever something is not making sense. So the goal of the next 30 minutes or so is to give you a really brief introduction to carbon markets. What is a carbon credit? What is a carbon offset? How are they generated? Who uses them and for what? And what needs to be true to ensure that this whole system results in something that's good for the climate? Then I'm going to take a moment to talk about Carbon Plan's work specifically regarding soil carbon in carbon markets. So what standards are currently out there and the key challenges of incorporating soil carbon into the carbon markets and accounting for outcomes. And last, I'm going to bring this back around and try to share some takeaways for those considering participating in these systems as farmers, hopefully also relevant takeaways for people trying to help farmers understand these systems and consider whether or not to participate. So to start out, we need to hit some key terms. A carbon credit is a commodity, a tradable commodity that represents 1 ton of CO2. Sometimes they're referred to as permits to pollute, but fundamentally, it's just a little certificate. It's something we have made up. And we say this made up thing represents a climate benefit equal to 1 ton of CO2. Carbon credits can be generated from a number of types of projects. You could have a regenerative ag project or a forestry project. Increasingly, you're seeing kind of more technological carbon removal enter the carbon markets. So, machines that are sucking carbon out of the air and turning it into rock underground. But the market deals and buys and sells with carbon credits, these things representing 1 ton of CO2. A carbon credit is not the same thing as a carbon offset, although the terminology can get kind of confusing. An offset, you would call a carbon credit a carbon offset if someone has bought that carbon credit and used it to claim that it cancels out an emission. So maybe I emitted 10 tons of CO2. I'm a company, I emitted 10 tons of CO2, and I want to be able to make the claim that I am carbon neutral. So I go to the carbon market and I buy 10 carbon credits and I use them to offset my emissions. So cancel out my 10 tons of CO2. The carbon market is kind of a squishy thing, but fundamentally it's just a marketplace within which carbon credits are bought and sold. You kind of have different marketplaces that exist from a very high level. You have regulated markets, so something like California cap and trade. It's a regulatory system in which offsets can participate. You also have the voluntary carbon market, where people are just participating because they want to be able to direct money to offset projects on the seller side, because they want to be able to make a certain climate claim on the buyer side. No one has to participate in these markets. They are totally voluntary, and they're growing like crazy as focus increasingly in the business world and in the personal world is trained on the importance of addressing the climate challenge. So, carbon markets we can roughly think about in terms of the seller side and the buyer side. And there are a couple of key parties or key definitions that I think are useful for getting a rough picture of how this market operates. First off, you have an offset project. So this is a project that actually does the good thing, generates the climate benefit on the ground. This is your farmer, this is your forestry project. You might also have a project developer who maybe comes to the farmer and says, let me represent your project in the market. I'm going to represent it to the system. I'm going to receive the credits for you. I'm going to handle selling them, and I'll take a cut of the profits. You have the registry, which is a standard setting body who is making the rules and issuing the carbon credits. And then you have protocols, and these are actually the rules by which a registry issues credits. So the complicated thing, if you are an offset project, if you're a farmer looking at this landscape, is that there are lots of project developers and several registries and many, many protocols. So if you're interested, for instance, in getting credit for implementing no-till agriculture, there are several registries, so several standard setting bodies who might give you credit for that. And each registry might even have several sets of rules by which you could get credit. So you could imagine that maybe you are looking at all of that optionality and choosing, or maybe a project developer comes to you and says, I'm going to work with this protocol, like, let me just get credits for you. It's not any extra work. And you'll get a little extra money in the end. On the buyer side, once those credits have been generated, you have in the marketplace right now a growing number of brokers, so people who are repackaging or reselling the credits that are generated by the registry. And ultimately, a credit ends up associated with a buyer who buys that carbon credit and retires it to claim ownership of the climate benefits. Again, buyers can be individuals, they could be corporations, they could be companies, governments, and they could be participating for a bunch of different reasons. They could use those carbon credits in lots of different ways. It could be motivated by the ability to make a public relations claim. It could be motivated by kind of making good on other climate goals and doing internal carbon accounting. You have lots of different buyers participating in these markets and making plans about doing climate action that rely on the ability to pay someone else to do the good climate thing. So in this system, where you have lots of different actors and lots of different ways that you could potentially generate carbon credits, lots of different ways where by which people could use carbon credits, there are a couple of key characteristics that are absolutely essential for high integrity outcomes. The first is, maybe most obviously, rigorous measurement and verification. So MRV is the shorthand, measurement, reporting, and verification. You have to be able to tell or ensure that a carbon credit represents something that actually happens. The MRV required to generate a carbon credit varies, again, but from protocol to protocol. So even though in the end you're looking at things that all look the same, they all look like 1 ton of CO2, the mechanism by which those tons of CO2, those carbon credits, were documented and verified may be really, really different and might affect your perception of the quality of that outcome or your confidence that it actually happened. The second really important characteristic for high integrity outcomes in a carbon market is a concept of additionality. This is a kind of tricky concept, so I'm going to sit on it for a second, and I invite questions about it later. The basic idea around additionality is that a climate benefit is additional if it would not have happened in the absence of the carbon market. So additionality is basically the difference between using the carbon market to generate new climate benefits, or if it's non-additional, simply allowing people to take credit for business as usual, taking credit for things that would have happened otherwise. What's really critical is that if a credit is non-additional, if it is representing a carbon benefit, a climate benefit that would have happened anyway with or without the extra carbon finance coming through the carbon market, it cannot credibly be used to offset an emission, to justify emissions. Since that is one of the primary uses on the buyer side of things, it's really important to ensure that if the credits are being used to justify ongoing emissions, it actually represents something new and good that is happening for the climate on the project developer side of things. Again, I would emphasize you see huge variability from protocol to protocol and from registry to registry. So you can imagine, again, you're looking at all of these carbon credits. They all look the same from the buyer side, but we know that actually the additionality of those carbon credits, whether or not they represent something new and beneficial for the climate, varies tremendously. And certain sectors have many more challenges regarding additionality than others. And certain projects have additionality challenges that are really real as well. The last integrity challenge that is particularly relevant to our conversation about soil carbon is the recognition that we need to be thinking about timescales, and we need a high integrity way of dealing with the value of temporary carbon storage. So we know that temporary carbon storage is not equivalent to ongoing CO2 emissions. when you emit a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, it has impacts for literally millennia. We also know that temporary carbon storage is not equivalent to permanent carbon dioxide storage. So if you are turning CO2 into rocks, it lasts in that form, it is stored in that form on geologic timescales. If you are sequestering carbon in soils, as you all know, you see huge variability through time, both based on management and based on other factors that you can't control, like drought. So temporary carbon storage can have a positive value, but it's less than 100% of a permanent removal, and it's less than 100% of a CO2 emission. And currently, the carbon market doesn't have a framework for thinking about what temporary carbon storage is worth. When buyers come to the carbon market, again, they see a bunch of carbon credits that all look like 1 ton of CO2. And credit A might represent 10 years of carbon storage, and credit B might represent 40 years. Credit C might represent 100 years. But right now, the market doesn't differentiate between those outcomes, which from a climate standpoint is a really clear failing. So, in summary, market is messy, many players, many different rules by which you could generate credits. Really critically, across a couple of dimensions, the carbon market currently fails to differentiate based on credit quality. You see huge credit quality variation across project sectors, across registries, across protocols, but buyers just see credits that equal 1 ton of CO2. And since this is not a regulated space, they have very little external incentive to pay attention to quality. They can just buy tons off the carbon market, they can claim that it offsets their emission, and there's no one checking to ensure that their claims match up with the actual climate outcomes that occurred. And there's no force driving them externally to differentiate between really high quality credits that represent someone doing something new, something real, something good for the climate, and someone who is just capitalizing on business as usual outcomes. The result of that lack of differentiation, in part, is that we've seen kind of some race to the bottom dynamics in carbon markets. So since I can come to the market and cut some corners because there isn't a strict standard and offer my credit for $5 a ton, but you are coming to the carbon market having done something really hard and real, having implemented a new practice on your farm, having done rigorous soil sampling, you probably needed more than $5 a ton of carbon dioxide to make all that happen. But we are competing right now just on price. If our credits aren't differentiated based on quality, a buyer just sees that I'm offering a credit for $5 a ton and you are offering a credit for $50 a ton. And unless they are savvy buyers, their incentive is to drive toward the lower price, higher volume credits. And again, the resulting low price point, which right now in the market is around $5 to $15 a ton of CO2, makes doing real things pretty difficult. I was going to pause there before I move on to talking about soil carbon in these systems specifically, and ask Sam if there are any questions in the chat that it would be useful to address now.
Yeah, thank you for pausing. I think there's a lot of questions that received that are kind of on the nitty-gritty of regulation, or like how does a farmer get into this? Maybe some of those we can keep to the end because I think you have a good amount of time for questions. But maybe 2 questions you could address right now. One is, it sounds like there's really not much in the way of regulation. Like, yes, there are registries that sort of have these budgets. Who oversees the registries? And then the other question that I think might be good to include now is, are there risks to a farmer or a landowner when they enter this market as having the burden of responsibility to deliver on building that carbon in whatever way they're doing it?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. So to the first question, no one is overseeing the registries. The voluntary carbon market is at this point unregulated. The registries, the most prominent registries, we call them the Big Five. They're actually nonprofit organizations. So they are private standard setting bodies. They basically make their income source is via the listing of projects and transaction of projects. So the registries kind of get to make their own rules. And similarly, so you have kind of who is overseeing the current standard setting bodies. The answer is no one at this point. On the buyer side, like who is overseeing what claims buyers can make with those carbon credits? Again, the answer is currently no one, although I think it will be really interesting to see from a consumer protection standpoint, and maybe financial regulation standpoint, what will happen in the coming years. To the second question, what are the risks to a farmer? Right now, these are not very high liability systems. So usually these systems have some sort of kind of insurance mechanism built into the crediting. Oftentimes, this looks like a buffer pool. So maybe by the rules that, okay, a farmer comes to a registry, they say, I'm going to use that protocol, and by this protocol, I should earn 10 credits. And the registry says, okay, well, great, you earn 10 credits. We're going to withhold a chunk of those credits in a buffer pool, in kind of like a pot of extra credits, just in case you have something happen that makes you release that carbon. You change practices, some external event occurs. So two thoughts on that. One is that right now, from my perspective, buffer pools don't adequately ensure risk from the climate standpoint. So I don't think they right now are set up to realistically account for risks through time. So from the climate perspective, I find them kind of lackluster. From the farmer perspective, however, if you enroll in one of these systems, you are not on the hook in any sort of deep liability sense. You can't double sell those credits. You have some boundaries in terms of like you can't list your land in 2 different registries. But if you have enrolled in one of these programs and you have received carbon credits, they usually have some system for kind of limiting liability to your participation in the market.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple more questions, but I think that they'll fit best at the end.
Okay, great. All right, so moving on to talk about soil carbon specifically in these markets. I mentioned early that excitement is high about soil carbon. And I guess it was about 6 months ago, my team decided to sit down and look at all of the protocols that are currently used to credit soil carbon in the marketplace. So that was 17 different protocols, so 17 different sets of rules that might give someone credit for soil carbon. And we looked at them across a couple of dimensions. The first was rigor. So this really had to do with the MRV, measurement and verification. Did they require soil sampling? What kind of soil sampling? Was there stratification? To what depth? Or do they not require sampling at all? Do they allow you to simply model your soil carbon, or without calibration, or maybe just claim a default factor. So you say, I'm getting no-till, and you get a set chunk of credits. The second dimension was additionality. So do these rules screen for new outcomes? The third was durability. So does the set of rules have in place mechanisms to ensure that the durability claimed, so I'm saying I'm going to store carbon for 10 years or 20 years, does the set of rules have mechanisms in place to make sure that is true? And the last is safeguards. We know that, carbon is just one tiny piece of what is going on in an agricultural system, both economically and environmentally. So the last dimension was, does this protocol have any safeguards around landowner rights, around data privacy, around practices that might be otherwise detrimental to broader ecosystems? What we found was that there is tremendous variation in measurement and verification rigor. So some protocols that a farmer could get credits under right now in the voluntary carbon market require really robust sampling. Others require no sampling at all. You also see across the board really weak additionality standards. There are some protocols under which you can get credit for something that you started 10 years ago. There are very few screens about adopting practices that are already widely adopted in your area. Overall, this additionality as a dimension is a really interesting kind of locus point for the tension between wanting to support and reward good practices point blank, and the kind of need for the system as a whole to make good on its claim that it's producing new climate benefits. And the last key takeaway was that most of these protocols have very short contract durations, often shorter than 20 years, which makes sense in the context of land management. Hard to promise to do something for the next 100 years, not really realistic. But again, you have this tension around supporting the good thing on a time frame that is realistic, and creating credits that people use to make climate claims. And how do you match up those two worlds in a way that actually makes sense from a scientific perspective? Again, I'm going to just pause there and see if there are any questions specifically about these soil protocols or these dimensions across which we analyzed them.
You know what, I might pitch you two questions right now. One might also help with the idea of additionality. So the question is, if I plan to cut down some type of forested area to increase my agricultural land for grazing, for crops, whatever it might be, and I decide not to do that because of the carbon market, does that count for additionality?
It's a really interesting question. So if you are saying, I have a forested area, if I get carbon finance, then I can say I don't have to cut down these trees. That would be an additional project. If you really needed that carbon finance, it comes in and that enables you to make a different choice. That is additional. However, that relies on something we call a counterfactual. What would have happened otherwise? So only you know whether you really would have cut down those trees. From the outside looking in, if I see someone saying, if I didn't get this carbon finance, I would have clear cut my land, or if I didn't get this carbon finance, I would cut down half of my trees. It's hard to tell if that is true or not. The crediting in that case relies on an assertion of a world that doesn't happen, of a world that we can't observe. That's a really key challenge in the whole carbon market, especially in forestry projects. So really interesting question, differs from the perspective of a market participant who knows what their decision is. You know whether you are generating an additional credit or not, versus a market observer who might have a much harder time telling whether or not the credits that are generated as a result are or are not additional.
Great, thank you. I think that was, I like your distinction between knowing your own intention versus being a market observer. That's definitely two very different mindsets. Another question, and I think you touched on this, but maybe to clarify a little bit more, is that you know, there are different ideas among scientists about the best way to measure carbon, and not everybody is in agreement. So, you know, how did your protocol assessment account for those differences of opinion and some science that is still developing?
Yeah, great question. We were fairly conservative. So within rigor, we looked at several dimensions. One, for instance, was do you take any soil samples or do you not? At this point, you know, there are many models that can tell you something or estimate something about soil health, but we know that, or soil carbon, but we know that soil carbon is highly variable across space, across the depth profile of your soil, and across time. So I think it's fairly evident right now that you cannot make an accurate measurement upon which someone else can justify emissions without taking soil samples. So that was one bifurcation. Do you have to ever sample your soil or no? In the sampling of the soil land, there is some evidence to suggest that it's really important to look at depth. It's more rigorous to look at, you know, more than 30 centimeters rather than, you know, some protocols may sample but may only look at the top 20 centimeters. So that was another bifurcation. How deep are those samples required to be? We also looked at things like, is there any guidance around stratification? You know, so there are lots of general principles, even though there is still a tremendous amount of science underway. There are general principles that right now, based on our level of confidence, we can say, yeah, you really need to sample your soil. Yes, it's better if you sample deeper than less deep, so on and so forth. You know, the flip side of all of this, as you all know probably better than I do, actually not probably, surely, doing rigorous soil sampling for soil carbon can be labor intensive, time intensive, and expensive. So, you know, eventually we need to find a balancing point where you have kind of something that is really feasible for people to do, and you have outcomes that are rigorous from the standpoint of the climate. And I will mention here that if you were not hitching the rewarding of the good thing, the rewarding of the good practice to a climate claim from the buyer, then yes, you would want some MRV, but the need for its rigor to be really high would be greatly reduced. So you are doing the practice, it's good, I can reward you, and that doesn't come hitched to a net negative climate outcome on the buyer side. So, you know, really it's the construct of tying these two worlds together that puts the onus on MRV and on additionality to meet a really high bar.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I'll keep the last couple to the end now, I think.
Okay, great, thanks, Sam. All right, so the last little chunk that I want to leave you with is just kind of a summary of takeaways for potential participants. I think it's really important to acknowledge that based on the system we currently have set up, you have some competing goals. So one is, as you all know, managing for soil carbon versus a more broad idea of soil health. Those are different things. Soil carbon, in my perspective, I wonder if it should be considered a co-benefit rather than the thing that finance for positive management practices hinges on. But right now, soil carbon really is the mechanism through which these markets are directing funding. And as such, you have this tension that I just want to highlight again between supporting and rewarding positive practices that are good for soil health and ensuring the market as a whole is positive for the climate. Second, again, I have said this, but just to emphasize, standards are variable, and weak standards don't mean that all projects are bad. Projects can operate with whatever level of integrity they choose to, but it does enable race to the bottom dynamics in the market as a whole and results in a really low price point that makes it difficult to do real things, to support actually changing price practices. I think, to put it kind of bluntly, as a farmer, as a land manager right now, you can participate in these systems kind of at whatever level of quality you choose to. And I think that that is a really interesting challenge and responsibility when you are also trying to think about how to finance the good things. But basically, you have the option to come to this market and generate credits for stuff you were already doing, for practices that don't necessarily need carbon finance to make them happen. But if you do so, it does on the backside kind of mess up the carbon accounting of the system as a whole. And should that fall just on projects? No, absolutely not. It is a problem that must be resolved at the system level. But the reality is right now, if you are a farmer or a land manager, that's the current state of affairs. So I just want to end with an emphasis on the fact that these are complex systems to understand. They are not foolproof right now. They do not guarantee positive climate outcomes. And in fact, they may actually kind of hitch your good thing to a negative climate outcome. And it's really up to you as a land manager or you as someone who supports land managers to choose with what level of integrity you want to interact in this system. And with that, I'm going to give us another blank slide, and I look forward to whatever questions appeared in the chat.
Great, thank you, Freya. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the question box. I have a few more questions that came in, and then we'll see where people land if anything else comes in. So one question, and this might be a little in the weeds, but maybe you know the answer, is does participating in the carbon market disqualify a farmer from other incentive programs? For example, if NRCS helps pay for your cover crop seed, can you turn around and use that to earn carbon credits?
Really important question. It again relates to this idea of additionality. So it depends on what the incentive program you're participating is. So if, for instance, you were participating in a program where you got finance for conserving your lands for a certain number of time, conserving your forest, the forest you said you weren't going to chop down. You're like, okay, I get an incentive from the government. I have promised not to chop it down, and I have gotten some money in return. If then you turn around to the carbon market and make the same claim, hey, give me some money and I won't chop down the forest, that is non-additional. Those claims conflict. If, however, you have gotten funding to do some positive practice that does not come with any sort of carbon accounting on the government side of things, on the incentive program side of things, they are just giving you support to, for instance, plant a cover crop. You can kind of imagine that government finance as a subsidy to the carbon market. I don't think that is the best state of affairs, but it doesn't cause problems from an additionality standpoint. And there's nothing stopping you from doing that, from kind of combining incentive systems.
Another question I think is just sort of visualizing how the process works. So I know it's going to be different relative to the protocol or the project registry, but could you give us an idea of, I'm a landowner, maybe I have mixed land use, forest and field. When I start this process, what does it look like? Do I need to come in with data, and do I need to have an idea of, what do I expect my upper limit of carbon sequestration to be? Yeah, how do you get started is the question.
I think right now the majority of projects do work with a project developer who knows the system, who will end up taking a cut of the carbon credits, but who will deal with all of the paperwork and process for you. So that's kind of a first caveat. If you are not working with a project developer, the flow is something like this. You go to the registry and you say, hey, I'm a project. Recognize me as a project. You are listed on the registry, and then you can develop a kind of description of your project according to the set of rules that you want to be credited under. So according to the protocol. And that might include just a lot of paperwork and modeling, or it might include some initial, for instance, sampling of your soil or measurement of your forest stocks. It really depends based on the protocol. But you will have some process for kind of initial documentation and getting listed as a project. And then usually for most of these protocols, you are credited through time. So every couple of years, there might be, a set of steps you have to go through to get the next tranche of credits. So maybe you measure your soil again, or maybe not. Maybe you just update your model. And those credits, when they are issued, they are yours. They will be tracked by the registry. Again, if you're working with a project developer, oftentimes they are taking care of selling those credits, connecting those credits to the rest of the market. But the buying and selling of the credits, once they are issued to you, can happen in a number of ways, direct to buyers, through a project developer, through a broker, etc.
Great, thank you. And I have one more question. And okay, this one's a little bit of a philosophical one, it seems like. So I think what the question's getting at is, if we have a goal of reducing net carbon, but these systems make us more equal in terms of it's an offset, but we're not pulling down an overall reduction, is that, I think, in conflict with broader climate goals?
Yes. I think the tension really is between broad climate goals and kind of the incentives of different players in this system. So I think one of the great dangers of offsets are that they can perpetuate the idea that there is a cheap and easy way to fix our climate problem, that rather than reducing your own emissions, you can pay someone else over there to reduce them. And obviously, if we are aiming to net zero emissions, you can't do that shuffling forever. We're going to have to reduce emissions everywhere we possibly can. So there's this really, really interesting tension between the broad climate goal, the reality that we all have to, own up to and live up to, and kind of the segmented perspectives on the market that a landowner might have, or a buyer might have. So short answer to the question, yes, I think that's an insightful question, and I think it's one of the trickiest realities of the carbon market as it exists today.
Another question that came in is, my understanding of the science is this: in undisturbed soils, soil organic matter and the carbon sequestered therein trend over time towards a long-term equilibrium, governed by things like moisture, temperature, which then in turn affect microbial activity. Tillage introduces oxygen, which accelerates organic matter breakdown. So there's sort of these processes in the soil. When tillage stops, if we go to a no-till system and the soil organic matter trends then back up to the long-term equilibrium level storing carbon. I think the question is saying, would you agree with that general assessment? I think trying to be between undisturbed soils, we have one level, and then we can go to reduced tillage to try to get back to that undisturbed level.
Mm-hmm. I actually would guess, Sam, that you might have more depth of knowledge than I do about equilibria through time and regime changes. Do you want to try to answer that question?
Yeah, I can try to answer that one. And I think if I didn't fully understand or interpret your question, please feel free to follow up. If we want to try to compare back to an undisturbed soil, that undisturbed soil can give us an ideal benchmark. And there are people like the Soil Health Institute trying to use that as what is the upper limit potential of a soil. So for example, they're saying, okay, here's your pasture, compare that to your adjacent forest. It's probably going to be the same soil type. And that shows you, best case scenario, but you have to recognize that you're probably never going to see in your even untilled field what you're seeing in your forest. That just really gives you the sort of nuts and bolts soil capacity. I think the other tricky thing is we don't have a lot in the way of undisturbed soil, at least not New Englanders. All of our forests at one point, were clear cut for agriculture. And so it can be hard to find what's our best case scenario soil.
I would just add to that very last point. One of the challenges of, for instance, soil carbon in comparison to forest carbon is that we've been keeping forest carbon data for several decades. We have kind of really excellent public data about soil carbon across the United States. The same is not true for soil carbon, and that complicates, benchmarking and quantification of soil carbon changes via modeling. So yeah, really interesting question. Tricky.
Yeah, I think that falls into the protocol space for some of us that are trying to make our brains behave with policy and methodology all in one thought, and it can be tricky. So here, and this might be another protocol type question, do protocols account for things like fossil fuels necessary to plant cover crops? Is all of that calculated into your carbon credit or offset?
Mm-hmm. Ideally, yes. Ideally, the carbon credit represents a net calculation. So what's the good thing that happened, and then what were all of the emissions associated? One of the kind of sub characteristics that we were looking at when we were asking questions about measurement rigor was about that kind of life cycle assessment. Does this protocol ask you to account for the emissions that are happening because of X, Y, and Z? Again, you see variability in how rigorously protocols ask people to do that, but theoretically, a carbon credit should represent a net calculation.
And okay, I'm just going to check my own time here. I think maybe we'll, I have one more question unless anybody else has any others, and then maybe we'll just take a few minutes before we transition to our last speaker of the day. Oh, let me see, where did that question go? Oh, here it is. Okay, so the question is, it seems that from this person's experience, there's not a lot of agencies currently operating in carbon credits in New England. I do know that there is some things happening in Vermont, and is that due to state size? You know, are our registries interested in smaller farms like what we have in Massachusetts?
Mm-hmm. So, a great question. Registries are not usually in the role of going out and seeking projects, recruiting projects. And, you know, traditionally, if you, basically, it's a kind of onerous process. So it has been more large systems participating in these markets rather than small systems. Increasingly, you're seeing projects, kind of aggregate projects that recruit a bunch of small landowners to participate, kind of bundle them together as a project developer and then go to the registry. You're also increasingly seeing you know, governments, state governments considering how to start tapping into this market. There aren't a lot of examples of how that has happened yet, but there's lots of talk. New Mexico, for instance, is talking about it. Other places are talking about it. So I would say, you know, there is no formal barrier to small farmers participating. And you're seeing some new models for how they might participate, but just from a logistics perspective, it hasn't made a lot of sense to date. Although increasingly, I think people are designing around the idea of getting small farmers to engage in carbon markets.
Okay, another question came in. I think the juices are getting flowing now. Does brush burning, such as prune does brush burning, example of brush being pruning, so maybe an orchard setting or tree slash, a positive or negative influence on soil carbon? So Freya, you can take that, or I can, however you want to.
I would hand that to you. I would say it probably depends on how it's done and what you're pruning. But I would hand it back to you, Sam.
Yeah, I would say, you know, if you're talking about burning, you're really going to emit a lot of that back into the atmosphere. And so you had it in a temporary sequestration in whatever you're burning, and say you burn it and you really rapidly release it. Unless you're doing something like, you know, I know people will bury and try to do like an in-field biochar where you bury that and you burn it. You know, it is really important to account for how carbon moves, so that we know, for example, cover crop residue, you know, maybe only 20% of that carbon is going to actually end up in your soil. The rest of the 80% is going to be lost through respirations as it's decomposed, which is why we know that you can really build soil organic matter at a rate of maybe 0.1% a year when you do out the math, in an optimistic setting, and it depends on the crop. So let's see. We have had a few more methods questions come in, and so maybe I'll just make a general plug. If you do have methods questions, I'm happy to chat about them. Please feel welcome to email me. I can also point people to, we had two really good presentations, one with Cornell and the influence of soil type on carbon sequestration. That has a huge effect, as well as a presentation on the different methods of assessing soil health. So that might answer some questions. I think that, oh, here's a question. Are there any known examples of smaller farms forming carbon co-ops? So if you do have smaller land and products aren't interested, are people banding together? Does that work?
Not that I know of yet. I don't see any reason why you couldn't. You know, yeah, I don't see any reason why you couldn't. It may address some of the kind of process challenges in terms of interacting with the system. Well, it depends what you're imagining by a carbon co-op, but banding together might kind of reduce the logistical overhead of interacting with the carbon market. You know, doing measurement and verification rigor across a bunch more farms, you know, doesn't actually reduce the complexity. So it might help some things, but not simplify some things, but not other things.
Great. Okay. I think that covered all of our questions. I will say Carbon Plan has a really good website, very user-friendly. You can access a lot of these protocols if you are curious to read through them. So please do that. I can send you the link if you can't find it. Freya, thank you so much for giving us this crash course on the carbon market. I think there's a lot of interest in this in Massachusetts and just figuring out how do people get started. This was really helpful.
Great. And I will also say I included my own contact information and the link to the soil carbon protocol analysis on a last slide in the slide deck. So if that is shared out, don't hesitate to reach out if there are any more questions floating about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for everybody that's on, our next speaker is going to start up at 1:20.